Part 1, Mark Civarella, the machine that crushed childhood. The courtroom was small, quiet, and painfully ordinary. Wooden benches. A raised desk. A man in a black robe sitting higher than everyone else in the room. Parents sat behind their children with straight backs and folded hands, believing this was a place of correction, not destruction. Teenagers stood alone at the front, nervous but trusting, assuming the adult in front of them was there to protect the idea of fairness. No one in that room believed they were stepping into a system designed to profit from their fear. Mark Civarella did not look like a villain. He looked like discipline. He spoke with confidence, carried himself with authority, and projected certainty. In public, he was known as a judge who believed consequences shaped character. He rejected excuses. He dismissed explanations. He promoted a philosophy built on control rather than understanding. Many adults admired him for it. They said he was tough but necessary. They said he was cleaning up youth crime. They said he cared enough to be strict. Inside his courtroom, that image felt convincing. He spoke quickly. He made decisions without hesitation. He rarely softened his tone. To parents, it felt like order. To the community, it looked like leadership. The idea that something darker was happening behind those rulings felt impossible. Trust does not disappear easily when it wears a robe. Civarella embraced what he called zero tolerance. In his view, discipline mattered more than context. Truancy was not a warning sign. It was defiance. Minor fights were not mistakes. They were threats. Small acts of rebellion were treated as proof of future danger. The system no longer asked why a child acted out. It only asked how fast punishment could be delivered. Then the structure changed. The county-run juvenile detention center was shut down. On paper, it was described as reform. The building was outdated. The system inefficient. Officials said private solutions would be better, faster, more modern. What parents were not told was that this closure created a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped private detention facilities. These centers were businesses. Empty beds meant lost money. Full beds meant profit. And suddenly, every ruling carried a new weight. Every sentence filled a space. Every child became a number. The mechanism was simple. The harsher the sentence, the fuller the facility. The fuller the facility, the more money flowed. The money did not move in daylight. It traveled through shell companies and disguised agreements. It was labeled as fees, as income, as routine transactions. On the surface, nothing looked illegal. Underneath, everything was rotten. Children as young as 11 were sent away for behavior that once earned a warning. A 12-year-old was locked up after a schoolyard argument. A teenager was detained for mocking a school official online. These were not violent crimes. These were moments of immaturity. But in Civarella's courtroom, immaturity carried a price. Hearings lasted minutes. Some ended almost as soon as they began. Many children stood alone without legal representation. No lawyer. No defense. No explanation of rights. Parents walked in expecting guidance and walked out watching their children taken away. The speed was shocking. The finality was absolute. There was no space for mercy. No pause for reflection. The system moved forward like a conveyor belt. One case after another. One child after another. The courtroom became a factory. And childhood was the raw material. For years, this continued. Families questioned the harshness, but they trusted the institution. Lawyers raised concerns, but their voices were isolated. Advocacy groups noticed unusually high detention rates, but the machine kept running. The belief that a judge could betray children for profit was too disturbing for many to accept. When the truth emerged, it landed like an explosion. Federal investigators uncovered a stream of hidden payments. Nearly $3 million had been exchanged over time. The money was tied directly to the detention facilities benefiting from Civarella's sentencing patterns. What once looked like strict justice was exposed as a calculated operation. The damage was staggering. Thousands of juvenile convictions were overturned. Each reversal represented a child whose life had been disrupted. Schooling interrupted. Families fractured. Trauma embedded deep enough to follow them into adulthood. Some struggled with trust. Others with authority. Many with anger they could never fully place. In court, Ciavarella defended himself. He claimed the payments were unrelated. He argued legality. He denied intent. But the pattern was undeniable. Case after case showed disproportionate punishment. Minor offenses met with extreme consequences. The pipeline was clear. When sentencing came, the language was severe. His actions were described as a tragedy on an epic scale. Not just financial wrongdoing, but moral collapse. He was sentenced to decades in prison. A length designed to ensure he would likely never walk free again. Some parents attended that hearing not for closure, but symmetry. They watched him in handcuffs. They remembered their children in the same position. The difference was that his suffering had an end point. Theirs did not. Today, his name is inseparable from the question that lingers long after the courtroom empties. How much is a child worth when justice becomes a transaction? How easily trust can be weaponized when authority is left unchecked? This story is not just about one judge. It is about how quickly protection turns into exploitation when no one is watching closely enough. If this case left you unsettled or angry, share what moment stayed with you the longest after hearing it. In the next part, the focus shifts to the architect behind the scenes, the men who built the structure that allowed this machine to run without resistance. Part 2, Michael Conahan, the architect of the pipeline. Michael Conahan never raised his voice in court. He did not need to. He did not posture, intimidate, or perform authority the way others did. Where Mark Ciavarella ruled from the bench with speed and severity, Conahan worked behind desks, budgets, and signatures. His power was quiet. Administrative. Procedural. That silence is what allowed him to remain invisible for so long. To the public, Conahan appeared unremarkable. Calm. Professional. A judge who understood systems rather than spectacle. He dressed plainly. He spoke carefully. He avoided controversy. While Ciavarella became the face of harsh juvenile sentencing, Conahan stayed in the background, shaping the environment that made those sentences profitable. As president judge, Conahan controlled far more than a courtroom. He controlled money. Contracts. Infrastructure. He decided where funding went and where it disappeared. He influenced which programs survived and which were dismantled. His authority did not rely on emotional force. It relied on paperwork. And paperwork, when trusted blindly, can do more damage than anger ever could. The first move looked harmless. The county-run juvenile detention center was labeled inefficient. Outdated. Too expensive to maintain. Reports were written. Meetings were held. On paper, closing it sounded responsible. Reform driven by efficiency. Modernization framed as progress. No parent reading those documents would have suspected what was coming next. When the public facility closed, there was no alternative system built to replace it. Instead, private detention centers stepped in. These facilities were marketed as solutions. Cleaner. Faster. Professionally managed. But unlike public institutions, they were driven by occupancy. Empty beds meant losses. Full beds meant revenue. That is where Conahan's role became critical. He helped steer contracts. He ensured public money flowed into private hands. He smoothed over resistance. He framed decisions as unavoidable. Necessary. Administrative. While Ciavarella sent children into detention, Conahan made sure there was always a place to send them. One controlled sentencing. The other controlled supply and demand. The pipeline was complete. Money moved quietly. Payments were not delivered in envelopes. They traveled through shell companies. They were disguised as consulting income, rental fees, finder arrangements. Each transaction was designed to blend into routine accounting. Nothing flashy. Nothing obvious. The kind of corruption that hides in plain sight because it looks boring. This is why Conahan was overlooked for so long. Parents did not see him. Children never stood in front of him. Lawyers rarely confronted him directly. He did not sentence minors. He did not shout rulings. He did not become a symbol. He was an administrator. And administrators are trusted to be neutral. Behind that neutrality was calculation. Every closed public option increased dependence on private facilities. Every approved contract locked the system tighter. The more entrenched it became, the harder it was to question. Judges came and went. Administrators remained. Conahan understood that longevity mattered more than visibility. For years, the machine ran smoothly. Complaints were isolated. Families blamed strict judges, not hidden agreements. Advocacy groups flagged concerns, but they struggled to trace cause and effect. It was not obvious that administrative decisions were directly shaping courtroom outcomes. That distance protected Conahan. The collapse began not with outrage, but with numbers. Federal investigators noticed financial irregularities connected to the detention facilities. Money trails that did not align with official explanations. Transactions that looped back through unexpected channels. The deeper they looked, the clearer the structure became. This was not individual misconduct. It was coordinated. When the story broke, it spread fast. The phrase "kids for cash" became a headline. And suddenly, Conahan's name surfaced alongside Chivarella's. The quiet architect was exposed. Conahan chose to plead guilty. His admissions confirmed what families had feared. The system had been deliberately manipulated. Children were not incidental casualties. They were the mechanism. The plea acknowledged fraud, conspiracy, and corruption. The calm administrator had knowingly helped dismantle public safeguards for personal gain. His sentence was severe but shorter than his partner's. Decades of administrative decisions reduced to years behind bars. For many families, it felt insufficient. They did not measure justice in time served. They measured it in lost childhoods. Then came the release. During the global health crisis, Conahan was granted compassionate release. He left prison early, citing medical risk. The announcement reopened wounds that had barely begun to close. Parents who had waited years for accountability watched as he returned home. The contrast was sharp. Their children had not been given compassion. Their families had not been given early release from consequences. The reaction was immediate. Anger. Disbelief. A sense that justice had been shortened by circumstance. For some, it confirmed the very lesson the scandal had taught them. Power bends outcomes. Even after exposure. Even after conviction. Conahan expressed remorse. He spoke about damage to the court's credibility. About regret. Some accepted it. Others did not. For many victims, remorse did not undo trauma. It did not restore trust. It did not return time. What makes Conahan's role so disturbing is not just what he did, but how quietly he did it. He did not need to intimidate children. He did not need to rush hearings. He simply altered the structure until injustice became routine. Until harm felt procedural. Until no one noticed where the blame should land. His legacy is not a courtroom moment. It is a system redesigned to fail the people it claimed to protect. When justice is built on contracts instead of conscience, when reform is written to hide intent, when authority operates without sunlight, accountability becomes optional. And once accountability becomes optional, harm becomes inevitable. Does justice expire when time passes, or does it linger unanswered long after the sentence ends? In the next part, the story shifts to a different kind of corruption, one where the evidence itself disappeared, and the damage spread through every case it touched. Part 3, Paul Pazanski, When Evidence Gets Consumed. The evidence room was supposed to be the safest place in the courthouse. Locked doors. Controlled access. Logged entries. Every sealed bag represented a promise that truth would be preserved exactly as it was found. Inside that room, nothing was meant to change. Nothing was meant to disappear. Paul Pazanski built his reputation on understanding addiction. He spoke about recovery. He talked about accountability paired with rehabilitation. In court, he presented himself as a judge who knew the difference between punishment and treatment. Defendants believed him. Court staff trusted him. Prosecutors assumed the evidence under his authority was protected by procedure and integrity. At first, the problem did not announce itself loudly. It appeared as small inconsistencies. Weights that did not match logs. Seals that looked disturbed. Evidence that seemed slightly off but not enough to trigger alarm. When questions were raised, they were brushed aside. Storage errors were blamed. Clerical mistakes were cited. No one wanted to believe the alternative. Audits were delayed. Reviews were postponed. Every request for clarification met with another layer of process. Evidence rooms are complicated spaces, and Poznanski relied on that complexity. The more technical the system appeared, the easier it was to hide behind it. Doubt lingered, but proof did not surface immediately. Then he left. Poznanski resigned quietly and took a position far away in Alaska. No public explanation. No formal farewell. The timing unsettled people who had already noticed irregularities. When a deeper review was finally conducted after his departure, the illusion collapsed. Packages of cocaine were missing. Others had been altered. In several cases, the contents no longer matched the recorded weight. Investigators found that some substances had been replaced with look-alike materials. Baking agents. Fillers. Substances meant to pass a glance test but not scrutiny. The trail pointed inward. Access logs showed repeated authorizations that did not make sense. Evidence that should never have left secure storage had been ordered into courtrooms without clear cause. Sealed containers bore fingerprints that belonged to someone who was not supposed to handle them. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. The truth was grotesquely simple. Poznanski had been stealing cocaine from evidence for personal use. The judge who sentenced people for drug offenses had been consuming the very substances that justified their punishment. Every lecture about recovery. Every ruling delivered with authority. Every sentence framed as accountability. All of it collapsed under the weight of that revelation. When confronted, he denied wrongdoing. He claimed procedural explanations. He argued that evidence was being handled as part of routine disposal or review. But the physical record told a different story. Weights did not lie. Logs did not lie. Fingerprints did not lie. The motivation was not financial gain. It was addiction. The same condition he claimed to understand. The same struggle he positioned himself as capable of judging with insight. The contradiction was devastating. The fallout spread fast. Cases built on compromised evidence were suddenly unstable. Prosecutors were forced into impossible positions. Some charges were dropped entirely. Others were renegotiated. Convictions that had once seemed airtight were now vulnerable. Defense attorneys questioned everything that passed through Poznanski's courtroom. The damage extended beyond individual cases. Trust in the system fractured. If a judge could tamper with evidence, how many other safeguards were illusions? How many outcomes were shaped by unseen hands? When sentencing arrived, the punishment felt light to many observers. The sentence focused on supervision, treatment, and restricted freedom rather than long incarceration. Debate erupted. Some argued that addiction deserved compassion. Others argued that abuse of judicial power demanded more severe consequence. What could not be debated was the end of his career. Poznanski lost his law license. He could no longer sit on a bench. His authority evaporated. The role that once gave him control over lives was gone. The system he betrayed removed him quietly, but permanently. Yet the question lingered. Who was harmed more? The defendants whose cases collapsed. The prosecutors forced to rebuild work poisoned at the source. Or the public, who learned that even the evidence itself was not sacred. There is something uniquely unsettling about corruption that touches physical proof. Bribes can be argued away. Bias can be debated. But evidence is supposed to be neutral. When evidence is consumed, altered, or erased, truth itself becomes unstable. Imagine standing in court accused of a drug crime, looking up at a judge who speaks about accountability, never knowing that the substance used to condemn you had already passed through his hands for reasons no one could see. Imagine learning later that your case was not decided in a clean system, but in one quietly rotting from the inside. Poznanski's story is not loud. There were no headlines about trafficking rings or massive financial schemes. Instead, there was a slow erosion of trust that spread case by case, log by log, gram by gram. The kind of corruption that hides until the damage is irreversible. When authority controls both judgment and evidence, the line between law and violation disappears. And when that line disappears, innocence and guilt lose meaning. Who is the real criminal when the person sworn to protect the truth becomes the one who consumes it? If one detail in this case changed the way you see the courtroom, let that thought shape what you share below. In the next part, the story turns darker, following a former judge whose power extended beyond the courtroom and into the lives of people he targeted in silence. Part 4, Tim Nolan, Power as a Hunting Weapon. The town was the kind of place where faces were familiar and reputations lasted decades. People waved at each other in parking lots. Families knew which names carried weight. When Tim Nolan walked through the community, he was not questioned. He was recognized. A former judge. A political figure. A man who had once sat behind the bench and spoken with the authority of the law itself. His resume looked flawless. Years in public service. A background in law. Connections in politics. Civic involvement that suggested responsibility and leadership. To many, he was proof that power could be earned and maintained through service. No one imagined that the same authority would later become a tool of control. Nolan did not target people with protection. He targeted people without it. The women who crossed his path shared vulnerabilities. Poverty. Addiction. Unstable housing. Legal trouble that left them frightened of the system. They were not searching for influence. They were searching for help. Nolan knew exactly how to present himself to them. He offered solutions. A place to stay. Money for groceries. Help with court issues. Advice framed as guidance. To someone drowning, it looked like a hand reaching down. What they did not see was the grip tightening underneath. The help came with expectations that were never written down. Compliance. Silence. Obedience. When a woman hesitated or questioned him, the tone changed. The reminders followed. He spoke about his past role. His connections. His ability to make problems appear or disappear. The message was clear without being spoken directly. He could hurt them without touching them. This was the mechanism. Support on one side. Threats on the other. Help if you cooperate. Consequences if you resist. The imbalance was absolute. He understood the psychology of fear better than most because he had once enforced it legally. He did not need to raise his voice. The memory of his authority did the work for him. For years, the pattern stayed hidden. Victims did not compare stories. Many believed they were alone. Others believed no one would believe them. The most chilling detail was consistent across accounts. The fear was not just of Nolan himself. It was of the system he represented. He had been a judge. That title carried weight long after he left the bench. Women believed that reporting him would end their chances in court. That the law would side with him automatically. That their histories would be used against them. Silence felt safer than exposure. The case began to unravel when one woman decided the risk of speaking was less than the risk of staying quiet. Her report did not stand alone for long. As investigators looked closer, other voices emerged. Different lives. Different circumstances. The same methods. Testimony stacked carefully, piece by piece. Offers that turned into pressure. Pressure that turned into control. Control that removed consent entirely. What had once seemed like isolated rumors became a pattern too consistent to ignore. Authorities widened the investigation. Charges multiplied. The language shifted from misconduct to trafficking. From abuse of influence to organized exploitation. The image of the respected former judge began to fracture in public view. When Nolan was arrested, the shock rippled through the community. The idea that someone so embedded in public trust could be accused of such acts felt surreal. For the victims, it was terrifying. Some feared retaliation. Others feared being dismissed. The weight of his past still hovered over every statement they gave. Eventually, Nolan admitted guilt. The plea confirmed what the investigation had revealed. This was not misunderstanding. Not poor judgment. It was a deliberate pattern of exploitation sustained over time. The courtroom that once amplified his authority now recorded his fall. The sentence was long. 2 decades behind bars. A punishment that acknowledged not just the acts, but the betrayal behind them. A judge is entrusted with the power to restrain others. Nolan had used that power to entrap. In statements after sentencing, the pain was evident. Relief mixed with anger. Validation mixed with years of damage that could not be undone. Some victims spoke about how long they had carried the fear. How the title judge had followed them like a shadow. How reporting him felt impossible until the system finally listened. What makes this case especially dark is not only what Nolan did, but what stopped people from stopping him sooner. The law itself became a shield. Authority became camouflage. The robe he once wore did not protect the innocent. It protected the predator. Even now, the question remains heavy. When the person who once embodied justice becomes the threat, who does the law actually protect? If one moment in this story forced you to reconsider how power works in small communities, hold on to that thought and share it in your own words. In the next part, the focus shifts to a courtroom where corruption did not involve money or violence, but a slow and suffocating abuse of authority that destroyed trust from the inside. Part 5, Don Gentry, a courtroom turned into territory. Family court is supposed to be the most careful room in the justice system. It is where decisions reshape lives quietly and permanently. Custody. Protection orders. Allegations of abuse. Futures decided without headlines. People enter already vulnerable, already afraid, trusting that the person behind the bench will listen before deciding. When Don Gentry took that seat, many believed she was a rising figure. Confident. Assertive. Well-connected. She spoke with certainty and moved with authority. To outsiders, it looked like strength. Inside the courthouse, it felt like something else entirely. Her power did not come only from the law. It came from control. From the beginning, Gentry worked to surround herself with loyalty. Staff members were sorted quickly into categories. Those who supported her were rewarded. Those who questioned her were isolated. Assignments changed without explanation. Schedules shifted. Access disappeared. The message spread without being written down. Agreement meant safety. Resistance meant consequences. The courtroom became less about impartiality and more about alignment. Employees described an atmosphere that felt suffocating. Conversations were watched. Disagreements carried risk. Decisions no longer felt rooted in policy but in personal favor. Professional boundaries blurred. Personal relationships crept into official spaces. The line between public duty and private ambition grew thinner every day. Gentry's influence extended beyond staff. Lawyers began to notice patterns. Attorneys who supported her political ambitions found doors open. Those who refused felt pressure. Hearings delayed. Motions stalled. Subtle signals sent from the bench that disagreement would not be tolerated. Family court is not a place where people feel powerful. Parents arrive scared. Children are discussed, not present. Decisions happen quickly, often with limited evidence. When fairness erodes in that environment, damage multiplies quietly. There is no spectacle. Only aftermath. Reports emerged that court employees were pushed into political activity. Campaign work framed as expectation. Attendance at events treated as obligation. Refusal interpreted as betrayal. The authority of the bench leaked into spaces it never belonged. Lawyers described being spoken to with hostility. Some said they were threatened with unfavorable treatment if they did not comply with informal demands. Others described reputations quietly damaged. The courtroom, once neutral ground, began to feel like a controlled zone where power flowed in one direction only. The work environment grew toxic. Staff members reported fear. Fear of retaliation. Fear of losing positions. Fear of being labeled disloyal. Professional judgment was replaced by survival instinct. In such an atmosphere, silence becomes policy. And silence protects misconduct. Complaints eventually reached oversight bodies. Not one accusation. Not one disgruntled voice. A pattern. Testimony from different people describing the same dynamics. Pressure. Favoritism. Retaliation. Abuse of authority that did not leave bruises but left careers damaged and trust shattered. An ethics investigation followed. Gentry dismissed the concerns publicly. She framed them as exaggeration, as political maneuvering, as resentment from those unwilling to accept strong leadership. But investigations do not rely on tone. They rely on consistency. And the accounts aligned too closely to ignore. The findings were severe. She was accused of failing to maintain impartiality, of using her position to advance personal interests, of creating an environment where judicial power was weaponized socially rather than applied legally. In family court, where neutrality is everything, this failure cut deep. There were no criminal charges, no handcuffs, no prison sentence. To some, that made the case seem smaller. But the consequences were final. Gentry was removed from the bench, stripped of the authority she had used to dominate others. Her career in the judiciary ended not with retirement, but with expulsion. For those who worked under her, the removal brought relief mixed with exhaustion. Some considered civil action. Others simply left the system entirely. The damage did not vanish with her departure. Decisions made under pressure could not always be undone. Families affected by biased rulings continued to live with outcomes shaped by a compromised environment. This case unsettles in a different way. There was no bribery, no secret money, no dramatic arrest. Just ego, control, the belief that authority was personal property, that the bench existed to reinforce identity rather than serve justice. It demonstrates a quieter form of corruption, one that hides behind procedure, one that thrives in systems where oversight moves slowly, one that feeds on fear rather than force. In family court, trust is fragile. People rarely have the resources to fight back. They depend on fairness because they have nothing else. When that fairness is replaced by favoritism, the system does not just fail. It betrays. Gentry's courtroom did not collapse because laws were broken loudly. It collapsed because they were bent consistently. Because power was treated as entitlement. Because listening was replaced by dominance. When authority becomes personal territory, voices disappear. And when voices disappear, justice follows. When the ego sits on the bench instead of humility, who is left to be heard? If this story reminded you how silent pressure can be just as destructive as open abuse, reflect on that feeling and put it into words. In the next part, the story moves to a judge whose rise symbolized progress, but whose fall exposed how personal loyalty can destroy an entire career. Part 6, Tracy Hunter, Where Power Meets Family. Her rise was framed as history in motion. When Tracy Hunter finally took the bench, supporters saw reform, representation, and a promise that the system could be challenged from the inside. The path there had already been turbulent. Legal battles delayed her seating. Arguments over ballots and authority filled the air before she ever heard a case. By the time she began her work, expectations were heavy and polarized. To some, she was a symbol of change. To others, a disruption waiting to happen. Inside the courthouse, tension followed quickly. Relationships with staff were strained. Prosecutors and administrators described friction that went beyond normal disagreement. Meetings became confrontational. Communication hardened. What should have been routine cooperation turned into quiet standoffs. The building felt divided long before any formal accusation surfaced. The fracture widened when questions emerged about a case that touched too close to home. Hunter's brother worked within the juvenile system and became the subject of an internal review. The process was meant to remain contained. Records restricted. Access limited. But concerns arose that confidential materials had been accessed improperly. Investigators alleged that Hunter used her position to obtain documents not available to the public, documents connected to her brother's situation. What made the allegation explosive was not only the act itself, but the principle behind it. Judges are entrusted to separate personal loyalty from legal authority. Even a single breach can collapse that wall entirely. In a system built on impartiality, perception matters almost as much as proof. An investigation followed. Then charges. The case unfolded slowly, publicly, and under intense scrutiny. Court hearings stretched on. Motions were filed and argued. Supporters rallied. Critics sharpened their stance. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Inside, testimony traced emails, access logs, and conversations that blurred professional boundaries. Public opinion split sharply. Some believed the prosecution was excessive. Others believed it was overdue. Claims of political motivation surfaced. Arguments about race and retaliation filled commentary. The courtroom became a stage not just for evidence, but for national debate. Every delay amplified the tension. Every ruling hardened positions. When the verdict came, it was narrow but decisive. One conviction. Others unresolved. To the law, it was enough. One count was sufficient to end a judicial career. The fall did not require a pattern. It required a line crossed. Sentencing did not bring closure. Appeals followed. Motions delayed enforcement. Time passed. The bench remained out of reach, but accountability had not yet arrived. For supporters, the delay fueled hope. For critics, it felt like avoidance. The case lingered in limbo, unresolved in the public mind. Then came the moment no one could ignore. In a courtroom filled with tension, the order was read. Custody was to begin. Hunter stood still. She did not walk forward. Officers approached. She resisted movement without violence, without words. They lifted her and carried her from the room. Cameras captured everything. The image spread quickly. Across news broadcasts. Across social platforms. A former judge being physically removed from the same space where she once presided. Supporters shouted. Detractors shared clips. The moment froze into symbol. For some, it represented injustice. For others, consequence. For many, it was simply unsettling. Authority reversed in public view. Power stripped away not quietly, but visibly. The aftermath was no less divided. Hunter served part of her sentence and was released early through routine credit. Her law license was suspended. She did not return to the bench. She continued to argue that the case had been driven by bias and politics rather than misconduct. Her supporters echoed that belief. The conviction, however, remained. What makes this story uniquely painful is how closely ideals and outcomes collided. Hunter entered the system carrying the weight of expectation. She spoke about change. About challenging entrenched practices. But reform demands discipline as much as courage. Boundaries exist not to protect institutions, but to protect fairness itself. When those boundaries blur, intention becomes irrelevant. This case was not about money. Not about hidden contracts. Not about profit. It was about influence and proximity. About how easily personal loyalty can distort judgment when power is within reach. One decision. One access point. One moment where restraint failed. In the end, the system did what systems do. It enforced rules without regard for symbolism. The same law that elevated her removed her. The same structure she challenged judged her conduct. History did not grant immunity. The tragedy lies in the collapse of possibility. What could have been a long career reshaping juvenile justice became a cautionary tale about limits. About how ideals do not survive unchecked authority. About how trust evaporates when personal interest enters official space. This story continues to divide because it forces uncomfortable reflection. Can reform come from within without becoming consumed by the very power it seeks to change? Can personal identity coexist with institutional responsibility without conflict? There are no easy answers, only consequences. When the boundary between family and authority dissolves, the fall is not quiet. It is public. And it is permanent. Where do you think the line should have been drawn, and what moment made you feel it was crossed? In the next part, the focus shifts to a courtroom where authority was not abused for loyalty or money, but through fear, silence, and actions that left no witnesses behind. Part 7, Herman Thomas, a closed room with no witnesses. In his courtroom, authority was absolute. Defendants stood alone, often without resources, often without options. Many came from poverty. Many lacked strong legal defense. When Herman Thomas spoke, outcomes shifted immediately. He had the power to decide freedom or confinement, leniency or severity. For people with little leverage, that power felt total. What unsettled observers was not what happened in open court, but what allegedly happened away from it. Stories began to circulate about private meetings. Not scheduled hearings. Not recorded conferences. Encounters without transcripts, without observers, without documentation. Defendants described being taken aside into closed rooms, separated from standard procedure. In spaces where no one else was present, the rules felt different. At first, the accounts sounded unbelievable. Judges are protected by layers of formality. Access is restricted. Movement is monitored. The idea that a judge would conduct undocumented meetings with detained individuals felt incompatible with how courts are supposed to function. That disbelief became a shield. Then the allegations repeated. Different individuals. Different times. Similar descriptions. Claims that favors were implied. That pressure was applied. That authority was used not through rulings, but through proximity and fear. Some said they were offered relief from punishment. Others said they felt threatened with harsher outcomes if they resisted. What united the accounts was imbalance. Consent does not exist where freedom is controlled by one person. Ethics investigators took notice. An inquiry opened, focusing not on guilt beyond doubt, but on conduct and standards. The goal was not punishment, but assessment of fitness to serve. Testimony was gathered. Patterns were examined. The picture that emerged raised serious concerns about how power had been exercised. Before any criminal case reached resolution, consequences arrived from another direction. Thomas lost his position. The bench he once controlled was no longer his. His authority evaporated through administrative action rather than verdict. Soon after, his ability to practice law ended as well. Career over. Title gone. The criminal case, however, told a different story. Charges were brought. The accusations were serious. But prosecution requires proof beyond doubt. Witness credibility was challenged. Defense arguments emphasized inconsistencies and motivations. The process stalled. Eventually, the criminal case collapsed. No conviction followed. In the eyes of the law, guilt was not established. That outcome divided the public. Some believed justice had failed. They pointed to the number of accusations and their similarity. Others argued the opposite. That the absence of conviction meant the allegations could not be trusted. That standards exist for a reason. That reputation should not be destroyed without proof. Between those positions lay uncertainty. Thomas maintained his innocence. He argued that his actions were misinterpreted. That private meetings were mischaracterized. That the witnesses were unreliable. Without a guilty verdict, those claims remained legally intact. Yet the loss of his career suggested something else entirely. Institutions do not remove judges lightly. This contradiction is what makes the case linger. On paper, he was cleared. In reality, he was finished. The system separated criminal liability from ethical trust. One demands certainty. The other demands confidence. Thomas no longer had the latter. For defendants who spoke out, the outcome felt incomplete. Some felt silenced again, this time by legal standards they could not meet. Others moved on, unwilling to relive the experience. The absence of a verdict did not erase memory. It only froze it without resolution. For supporters, the acquittal was everything. Proof that allegations alone should never define a person. Evidence matters. Process matters. They argued that the system worked exactly as intended. Both sides looked at the same ending and saw different truths. What remains undeniable is the power dynamic at the center of the story. When a judge controls outcomes, access, and interpretation of behavior, the room itself becomes charged. In such spaces, oversight is essential. Documentation is protection. Witnesses are safeguards. Remove them, and ambiguity flourishes. This case exists in that ambiguity. No dramatic sentencing. No televised verdict. Just a quiet removal, a failed prosecution, and a legacy wrapped in doubt. The courtroom returned to routine. Files were closed. But the question refused to disappear. Trust in the justice system relies not only on verdicts, but on confidence that power is exercised visibly and responsibly. When actions move into shadowed spaces, even innocence feels fragile. Thomas did not leave behind a clear answer. He left behind a dilemma. How to measure truth when proof cannot reach it. How to reconcile acquittal with consequence. How to decide what standards should protect the public when criminal thresholds are not met. In the end, his story does not resolve itself. It unsettles. It asks whether systems built to judge can ever fully judge themselves. And it leaves one question suspended between law and conscience. Does being found not guilty mean being free from doubt, or does doubt live on when power once operated unseen? If this case made you pause at the space between legal outcome and public trust, share what that pause revealed to you. In the next part, the focus turns to a judge whose authority did not rely on secret meetings, but on control exercised openly, repeatedly, and without remorse. Part 8, Sherry K. Stevens, Manipulation Without Money. The spotlight arrived through a case everyone recognized. Televised proceedings. National attention. A courtroom turned into a stage where every pause, every ruling, every facial expression was studied. For a moment, Sherry K. Stevens was seen as steady. Controlled. A judge capable of managing chaos with patience. That image did not last. What followed was not scandal in the traditional sense. There were no envelopes. No secret payments. No arrests. Instead, there was something colder. A pattern of control exercised openly, repeatedly, and with little explanation. The kind of authority that does not need to hide because it believes it cannot be challenged. Stevens ruled with an iron grip on process. Motions were cut short. Arguments were interrupted. Attorneys felt their words were weighed not by merit, but by tone. Those who complied moved forward. Those who questioned felt resistance. The courtroom became predictable in the worst way. Outcomes seemed settled before hearings ended. Complaints began quietly. Lawyers spoke among themselves. Defendants whispered about unfairness. Public defenders described a sense of futility. They prepared arguments knowing they might never be heard. Requests for time were denied. Evidence was dismissed without detailed reasoning. The law was present, but participation felt optional. Delays became routine. Cases stretched on without clear cause. Hearings were postponed again and again. Continuances piled up. For families waiting on resolution, time itself became punishment. Witnesses relocated. Memories faded. Momentum dissolved. Justice did not arrive late. It simply never arrived at all. Those delays were not neutral. They shifted leverage. People grew exhausted. Some accepted unfavorable outcomes just to end the waiting. Others lost resources trying to keep up. Delay became a tool, whether intentional or not. And in a system where time equals power, that tool cut deeply. Attorneys filed appeals. Higher courts reviewed records and found problems. Procedural errors. Misapplication of standards. Decisions reversed. Each reversal chipped away at the image of authority. Yet Stevens remained on the bench. The system moved slowly. Oversight takes time. Meanwhile, the courtroom kept operating. Accusations expanded beyond rulings. Lawyers reported intimidation. Contempt threatened over minor disagreements. Spectators removed for perceived disrespect. Voices lowered not out of respect, but caution. A judge does not need to shout to silence a room. Silence grows naturally when consequences are unpredictable. Former staff members echoed similar concerns. They described an atmosphere of fear. Of walking carefully. Of avoiding disagreement. When internal checks fade, power concentrates. When power concentrates, behavior hardens. The robe becomes armor. What made this case especially frustrating was its ambiguity. Many actions fell within discretion. Judges are allowed wide latitude. Authority is protected for independence. That protection becomes a shield when patterns emerge without clear violations. The gray area is where trust erodes quietly. Oversight bodies received complaints. Files grew thicker. Testimony accumulated. Patterns were described. Not one explosive incident, but many small ones pointing in the same direction. The picture that formed was not criminal. It was corrosive. Stevens was never arrested. No charges were filed. To some, that meant vindication. To others, it meant the system could not reach behavior that damaged fairness without breaking laws outright. The difference mattered. The harm remained. Over time, isolation set in. Attorneys avoided the courtroom when possible. Assignments shifted. Reputation changed. What once felt like control now felt like distance. Pressure did not arrive as punishment. It arrived as silence. Eventually, Stevens stepped away from the bench. There was no dramatic exit. No hearing broadcast. No final ruling that closed the chapter. She left quietly. For some, it felt anticlimactic. For others, it felt overdue. Those who had passed through her courtroom carried memories that did not disappear with her departure. The damage of procedural manipulation is difficult to quantify. There are no headlines for delayed hope. No statistics for silenced arguments. No ledger for decisions rushed or postponed until options collapsed. Yet the impact is real. Lives remain suspended. Trust thins. Confidence fades. This story challenges a common assumption. That corruption requires money. That abuse requires secrecy. Stevens demonstrated something else. Control can operate in plain sight. Authority can bend outcomes without leaving fingerprints. Justice can be eroded without a single illegal act. When appeals overturn decisions, the record shows error. But the time lost cannot be returned. Children grow older. Families fracture. Opportunities vanish. Reversal is not restoration. It is acknowledgement without repair. The coldness of this case lies in its subtlety. No villain captured on camera. No confession. Just a system slowly tightening around those least able to push back. The feeling of standing in a courtroom and realizing your voice carries no weight is difficult to explain. But those who experienced it never forget. Stevens did not take money. She did not traffic influence. She exercised power until it hollowed out confidence. And when confidence is gone, justice becomes procedural theater. Her departure closed a chapter but left a question unanswered. If justice depends on time, and time can be controlled, how long can fairness survive before it disappears entirely? If you have ever wondered how silence can shape outcomes more effectively than force, that reflection belongs here. In the next part, the story turns to a judge who did trade influence for gain, where messages and money exposed how quietly a verdict can be purchased. Part 9, Michael Maggio, a verdict bought with ballots. Ambition has a way of changing how rules are interpreted. Michael Maggio wanted more than a quiet career on the bench. He wanted elevation. Visibility. A seat that carried greater influence and longer reach. Campaign plans began to take shape while he still held the power to decide cases that mattered deeply to powerful interests. Politics and justice share a dangerous border. Maggio stepped too close to it. As he prepared for an appellate run, money became essential. Campaigns require resources. Advertising, organization, endorsements. That need created opportunity for people who understood leverage. Among them were business figures facing serious legal exposure. A civil case involving a nursing home death carried enormous financial risk. A jury had spoken with clarity. The damages were devastating. Then the case reached Maggio. What happened next stripped away any illusion of distance between politics and the courtroom. The ruling did not simply adjust the verdict. It slashed it. The reduction was extreme. What had been a crushing judgment was cut down to a fraction. For the family, it felt like erasure. Years of grief and testimony diminished by a single decision. Suspicion followed immediately. The timing felt wrong. The magnitude felt wrong. Observers asked how such a drastic change could be justified. At first, it remained a question without proof. Judges are granted discretion. Rulings can be defended through legal language. Without evidence, doubt remains just doubt. The evidence arrived quietly. Messages surfaced. Texts exchanged with donors and intermediaries. Conversations that hinted at expectations rather than coincidence. Financial records revealed donations moving through political committees. The flow was indirect but consistent. Money traveled a path designed to look lawful. The intent behind it did not. Investigators connected the dots. What emerged was not a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. It was a transaction. Campaign support in exchange for judicial action. Influence converted into outcome. A verdict transformed into currency. The law was no longer the guide. It was the cover. Maggio resigned from the bench as scrutiny intensified. But resignation did not end the inquiry. Federal prosecutors pressed forward. The case was built not on rumor, but on documentation. Messages. Transfers. Timelines that aligned too perfectly to ignore. He pleaded guilty. The admission removed any remaining ambiguity. He acknowledged accepting contributions with the understanding that he would reduce the judgment. The plea was a confession to trading trust for advantage. In that moment, the distance between judge and politician collapsed completely. Sentencing followed. A decade in federal custody. The court emphasized betrayal rather than amount. The crime was not only corruption. It was the destruction of faith. When a judge sells a ruling, every ruling becomes suspect. The family at the center of the civil case finally had a voice that could not be dismissed. They spoke about believing in the system. About trusting a jury. About watching justice unravel through a single altered decision. Money could not restore what was lost. Accountability, they said, was the only remaining form of recognition. What makes this case so stark is its simplicity. There was no violence. No threats. No secret rooms. Just ambition meeting opportunity and deciding that ethics were flexible. It shows how quietly justice can be purchased when oversight assumes good faith. How easily the robe can be mistaken for immunity. Maggio attempted to explain his actions as poor judgment rather than corruption. The argument did not hold. Poor judgment does not require coordination. It does not require messages and money moving together. This was not a momentary lapse. It was a plan. After prison began, appeals followed. Requests for leniency. Arguments about character and intention. None succeeded. The sentence remained. The career was over. The chance to hold office again vanished completely. For the public, the case left a bitter aftertaste. It confirmed a fear many try to ignore. That outcomes can be influenced without visible pressure. That justice can be reshaped far from the courtroom floor. That votes and verdicts can intersect in ways that benefit only those who can afford access. The damage extended beyond one family. Every litigant who stood before Maggio after learning the truth questioned their own outcome. Every lawyer wondered whether decisions had been weighted. Every future ruling in the region carried a shadow. Trust does not recover quickly once it is sold. This story is true because it leaves nothing abstract. No psychological theories. No gray ethics. Just cause and effect. Money moved. A verdict changed. A judge confessed. Consequences followed. And still, the question lingers heavier than the sentence itself. When justice becomes a commodity, who absorbs the cost? If one detail in this case made the betrayal feel unmistakably real to you, put that reaction into words and let it stand on its own. In the next part, the focus shifts to a judge whose power did not involve cash or campaigns, but bias and retaliation that reshaped families behind closed doors. Part 10, John C. Roach Jr., The Gavel of Prejudgment. Family court rarely looks dangerous from the outside. There are no sirens. No juries packed into benches. No dramatic verdicts read aloud for cameras. And yet, few rooms carry more quiet power. In that space, decisions determine where children sleep, who they live with, and which parent becomes a visitor instead of a guardian. Authority there is not loud. It is surgical. John C. Roach Jr. held that authority for years. He presided over cases where emotions were already exhausted before the hearing began. Parents arrived worn down. Resources thin. Hope fragile. In that environment, the judge's tone mattered as much as the law. What many families began to describe was not simply disappointment with outcomes, but exhaustion from a process that felt closed before it opened. Accusations of bias emerged gradually. Not one explosive complaint. A pattern of experiences that sounded eerily similar. Attorneys said rulings seemed predetermined. Litigants felt cut off mid-explanation. Some reported that challenging decisions led to consequences rather than clarification. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavy. Those who questioned Roach's rulings described subtle punishment. Speaking time reduced. Motions denied abruptly. Hearings rushed. The message was not announced, but it was understood. Opposition would not be welcomed. In a system that depends on advocacy, discouraging voices is a powerful act. Concerns deepened around closed proceedings. Family court already limits public access, but critics claimed Roach relied too heavily on secrecy. Cases sealed. Records restricted. Decisions shielded from scrutiny. Transparency faded, and with it, accountability. When outcomes cannot be examined, they cannot be corrected. Families described leaving court confused. Not because they lost, but because they never felt heard. Some said evidence was dismissed without explanation. Others said recommendations from child advocates were ignored. The process felt rushed toward conclusions that had already formed. Lawyers began documenting patterns. Complaints reached oversight bodies. Not allegations of money changing hands. Not accusations of crime. But of something harder to define and easier to deny. A judge allowing personal judgment to outweigh procedure. An investigation followed. Disciplinary review does not move quickly. It gathers testimony quietly. It compares accounts. It looks for consistency rather than drama. As scrutiny increased, pressure mounted. Roach faced the possibility of formal removal from the bench. Before that process concluded, he stepped down. The resignation avoided a public reckoning. There was no hearing that laid everything bare. No final ruling on the record that explained each complaint. He left the bench, and the system moved on. For some, it felt like an ending. For others, it felt unfinished. The families did not move on so easily. Custody arrangements remained. Relationships altered by past rulings did not reset. Children grew up inside decisions that could not be appealed easily, if at all. Even when cases were revisited, time had already done its work. Distance had formed. Bonds had changed. The fatigue surrounding this case comes from its persistence. There was no singular moment of collapse. Just years of small decisions accumulating weight. A sense that fairness had slowly been replaced by control. That the gavel did not simply end debate, but prevented it. Roach did not face prison. He did not confess to corruption. His case exists in a quieter category. One where authority is exercised within the boundaries of discretion, but consistently in ways that leave damage behind. That gray space is where trust erodes most effectively. For critics, his departure was overdue. For supporters, it was unnecessary. For those who stood before him, it was too late to matter. The system protects judges from hasty judgment for good reason. But that protection can feel like abandonment when harm is cumulative rather than explosive. This story leaves behind a lingering ache rather than shock. It forces reflection on how much influence a single person can wield without breaking laws outright. How power, when combined with impatience or personal bias, reshapes lives quietly. How the absence of voice can be as damaging as overt wrongdoing. Family court does not offer clean endings. It offers decisions that echo. When those decisions are shaped by predisposition rather than listening, the echoes last for years. Roach's name may fade from headlines, but the question his tenure leaves behind does not fade easily. How many decisions were made while someone stood in silence, unheard, waiting for a chance that never came? If this final story left you feeling drained rather than outraged, put that feeling into words and let it speak for itself. What comes next is not another case, but a reckoning with how fragile justice becomes when authority stops listening.